Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this second live Q&A of the, I was going to say the spring term, but it really doesn't feel very spring-like at all today. Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to as I look out the window here at second live Q&A. It's very wintry in feel, and tonight I'm delighted that we've got Mike Dolton with us. Mike Dolton is a senior lecturer in human geography here in the Department of Geography, and he specialises in social and urban geography in particular. And Mike, as many of you will have seen, gave a brilliant lecture last week looking at kind of contemporary urban environments, new urban challenges, and speaking about place making and identity and gentrification and urban governance and all kinds of really important contemporary urban issues. For those who weren't here able to join last week, Mike is going to give a quick summary. But first of all, Mike, do you want to just kind of introduce yourself and say a little bit about what we hope to achieve this evening?
Hi, as Al says, I'm Mike Dolton. What do I want to achieve today? Well, essentially just going back over the lecture, really, I want you to really grasp the different kind of scales, the different geographies at work when we try and understand what we can see in our locale. So, when we walk out of our front door and onto the high street, the kind of global processes that are impacting on the streets that we live in, really, our everyday lives. And I think hopefully I've tried to make some of those connections through ideas around regeneration, how regeneration is governed, and also thinking about how contemporary forms of regeneration are leading into increasingly gentrified spaces.
Brilliant.
And I think carry on. Sorry.
No, Mike, that's going to be absolutely fantastic, because I know that those issues that you're talking about and that you're expert in are really relevant to both GCSE and to A-level students in the UK. So to hear more, to hear you talk in greater depth about those topics, I know will be of real interest to teachers and students alike. And I think it's also worthwhile just saying to people that you have also prepared a teaching resource that's now available on our Teacher Hub. So that accompanies this Q&A and the lecture that you gave last week, and we'll give out details of that right at the end of this of this session.
Yeah.
So I forgot to introduce myself at the start. So I'm Dr. Alistair Pinkerton. I'm a reader in geopolitics in the Department of Geography here at Royal Holloway, and I also happen to be the Director of Recruitment for the department too. So it's fantastic that so many of you have been able to join us in this series so far. Mike, let me turn back to you. Can you perhaps, for those of you people who weren't here last week or who just need to be reminded, can you perhaps just run through some of the key highlights of last week's lecture for us once again?
Okay.
Thanks.
So we started off thinking about what regeneration is. So basically revitalising our neighbourhoods, making them a bit more sparky and a bit more shiny. And, the idea is to make them better places for us all to live in. And that can be around economic regeneration, but also the kind of beautification of our spaces, making them places that we just feel kind of happier being in. I think that's also part of what regeneration could be about, should be about, and hopefully is about. It's not always the case. I then linked regeneration to ideas around governance, as I was just saying. Who's able to decide on what kind of regeneration is appropriate, for the particular locale? And that might be, again, influenced by the need for economic growth. It might be to address local housing conditions, the local high street, all sorts of local infrastructure, for example. So clearly, who's responsible for regeneration is important. I know that at A level you do look at what governance means, and quite often we think of governance in terms of the local government or the central government, public administration governing those spaces. But clearly, there's a number of other actors now involved in the governing of spaces. At a global level, we looked in the lecture at global speculative investments, but also we need to think about who some of the other actors are. So it could be, what role do local communities play in governing their own spaces? And I think that's really important too. So we used 9 Elms, which is ongoing as a classic kind of form of what's been termed super gentrification, and again that throws up some problems around the kind of rather simplified notion of what gentrification is. In the lecture, we looked at how Ruth Glass, for example, came up with the idea when she was looking at more kind of gentle processes of gentrification in central and west London, around Ladbroke Grove, around Kensington, and she saw that professional classes were moving in over time, and that gradually impacted kind of housing structures, the quality of housing, the value of housing, and the value also of other kind of resources that we take for granted, things like shops, restaurants, etc. And as values rose, we saw people with lower incomes gradually being pushed out of those spaces. But it feels almost, it'd be interesting to see what viewers think about this idea of it being almost more of a kind of natural process of cities constantly changing, moving, evolving through time and space. We then looked at Nine Elms and thought how this is a kind of new form of gentrification, isn't it? So the local state bringing in global capital really to transform a space and pursue economic development really through that gentrification. So it's a kind of state-led gentrification, and also what geographers like Loretta Lees have talked about being this kind of super gentrification. Very different to the gentrification that Ruth Glass saw back in the 50s and 60s. So there are these different forms of gentrification at play, often working in combination, that I think it's important for us to understand, observe, make sense of. And last but not least, we looked at where does the community fit in? In these forms of gentrification, quite often the community will be consulted, and consultation's a really important part of regeneration processes and policies. Not only in the UK, but increasingly at a global level. But where does community fit in? Are their voices heard and acted on? And that's important. And we're going to talk about the Cressingham Gardens case study a little bit later. I'm very conscious that I've kind of based the talk around London, but clearly these are global processes, and maybe we can pick up on that through this discussion tonight. So that pretty much encapsulates it, I think.
Oh, brilliant, Mike. That's a super summary, and I think you've made it really vivid for us, the different kind of forces that are propelling urban change, or at least some of the forces that are propelling urban change in the early 21st century. And we've had lots of questions that have come in over the past week, and I'm going to put some of those to you, if I may. And
indeed, fire away.
I will also
I'd love to see what people think.
That's great. And I'm also just monitoring the comments in the sidebar on Facebook as well. So if any other questions come in, please feel free to ask, and I'll put them straight to Mike. So, Mike, I'm really interested in, and I think a lot of people at home are really, really interested in gentrification, probably because it's something that they can all see in the communities around them. It's something that they study theoretically and conceptually at A-level, but it's also something that is existing in almost every community in the country, at least to some extent. And let's face it, if it's not happening in your community, we see it all the time, don't we? Encouraged on television programs and all kinds of things like that as well. So in terms of those two different almost kinds of gentrification that you were talking about, the glass style gentrification. Can you just tell us more about that theory and that concept and those observations that were being made back in the 1950s and 1960s? What we might think of as a slightly more organic kind of gentrification.
Well, the idea is, for anyone that went to university, that's watching this or planning on going to university, you're a quintessential part of that more kind of organic gentrification, I would argue. So, Ruth Glass saw people, professional classes, if you like, doctors, teachers, etc., trying to find affordable housing, which we all do. And so they naturally moved into kind of poorer parts of the city, if you like, or the town. And, they'd have the capital to essentially, renovate their housing. And with that, they'd be bringing higher incomes, rates would go up, they'd be paying more money into the local authorities' coffers. they'd be wanting to buy things that maybe aren't for sale in those areas. So bit by bit, shops would start to follow them, if you like. Cultural spaces, sites of consumption, the sorts of restaurants that they want to eat in, if you like, the shops that they want to, shop in, the sorts of things that they want to buy would start appearing in the shops. And, bit by bit, there would be that kind of transformation. I'm being really anecdotal. I love a good anecdote, frankly, and that's probably my big downfall. But where I live in South London, there is a gradual process of gentrification going on. And it's very noticeable in the local budgets, for example. And maybe you can all do a poll, you can go into your local newsagents yourselves and see what kind of newspapers are being sold. Less and less people are reading hard copies of newspapers, has to be said. But where I live, I've seen the numbers of kind of the Observer, if you like, and the Guardian, these big piles growing as these more kind of professional classes, and the Telegraph as well, that show the kind of change. It's a very simple proxy, but it's interesting how over time people move into more affordable areas, and the land values, property values tend to go up, and all the kind of lifestyle that goes with that, and the kind of economy around those new lifestyles tends to follow them. So yeah, that is a more organic process, I think, that Ruth Glass was looking at. Yeah. The implications, it has to be said, for communities in those spaces are no less serious. It's just that it seems to be happening over a slower timescale. Yeah, and populations move around the city.
Yeah, I mean, I use the term organic because in order just to try and differentiate it from the more state-led kind of gentrification that you were also referring to in the lecture. So, of course, with this particular kind of gentrification, there's nobody directing the teachers, the doctors, the professionals to go to particular places. It's the market. They're determining where property is affordable. And of course, what then happens is they're changing the conditions of the place in which they live after they move there. And
absolutely,
it's perhaps unsurprising that one of the most responsive and visible signs of that is the way that local shops then start catering for those changing tastes. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if the size of the Guardian or the broadsheet newspaper mountain in a Budgeons, that's probably a pretty good proxy for some kind of change.
Yeah.
Or the presence of organic milk, or whatever it may be.
Yeah,
all of those things perhaps show change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was saying about students earlier. I mean, it's one of the things we're seeing in London and other cities is this idea of, it's called studentification, which is another form of kind of gentrification and not necessarily gentrification at times, but a kind of pushing out of the people that live there. That's certainly been a criticism. But I take a more kind of benevolent view, really, in that students will, they'll graduate. Quite often they'll stay in the parts of the city that they've studied in, but also they'll congregate again around areas with cheaper rents, cheaper land values, and that as they coalesce, as they get jobs, as their incomes increase, as the kind of again the kinds of forms of consumption that they're interested in develop, follow them, then we see things like, the gentrification of Shoreditch, for example, in East London, everybody talks about. But I would probably put that within that lens of a more kind of holistic, organic form of regeneration. The state followed and capital followed, but I would certainly separate that out from these forms of state-led gentrification that we looked at in places like Nine Elms, but also the Aylesbury estate in the Elephant and Castle, for example.
And I mean, if you think about a city like London, London arguably has undergone a kind of hyper gentrification, by comparison to other British cities, because of just the intensity of capital that's available. So going back, thinking about Notting Hill in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was quite a marginal neighbourhood, and of course it famously became somewhere where Irish immigrants would settle, and increasingly Caribbean immigrants into the UK would settle after the 1960s. And then when you think about Notting Hill now and the transformation that space has undergone, that must be one of the neighbourhoods that first, at least in the modern context of gentrification post Ruth Glass, it's probably one of the original neighbourhoods that's undergone that gentrifying change.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's certainly something that Ruth Glass picked on, yeah.
Yeah. We can think about neighbourhoods in probably every British city that have undergone similar things.
I think a good idea is for certainly if you're watching, for all of you watching this, when you get back to the classroom, I mean, what you could do is actually look at your high street or your local street on Google Maps, and just look at it you can access kind of a time scale. So you can look at images of your street, your high street, over the last potentially decade, 15 years potentially, and just look at the urban fabric. See how the streets have changed. See how the kind of shops have changed, the retail spaces have changed, the housing has changed, and you'll get a sense of your own kind of localized forms of potential gentrification or not. So it's a nice little exercise to root these ideas in, your local spaces, wherever you are.
Mike, one of the things that I'm really interested in this conversation is the issue of power and who has power and who doesn't. Because you talked about the really important role that the community plays in feeding into these kind of processes, formally, but also less formally. So it could be about making objections to the local planning authority, and things like that. But I wonder, in terms of power, where do you see that sitting, or what are the challenges that people face in exercising their power these days?
Oh goodness, where's the power? Who governs? I think that is changing. Certainly in the UK potentially, but at a global level, you have to say, and at a UK level, the power is increasingly in the hands of the developers, working with city authorities. Gentrification has been a key part of economic renewal, of creating competitive cities within competitive districts rather within competitive cities that can compete at a regional level and a global level. So, right across the planet, we're seeing spaces transformed into these new shiny hubs, really, of economic growth. So where do local people fit in there? Well, quite often they're dispossessed, they're dispersed, and that's a real issue. I gave you the examples of the Haygate estate and also the Aylesbury estate in the Elephant and Castle. A similar process is happening all over the planet, really, but here we see the local communities being very heavily involved, being consulted with a range of proposals on how they'd like to potentially see their estates being regenerated. So the local authority would give them a range of options, from repairing their housing all the way through to complete demolition and replacement. So they voted on these ideas, and funnily enough, they wanted to keep their homes and get them repaired. And it transpired that the houses were being demolished. So in that sense, where is the power? Well, it's clearly with the property developers who see these sites as a way of maximising what we call the rent gap that Neil Smith talked about, and I talk about in the lecture, but also the local authorities managing to extract value from this process as well. And so they'll use their powers of things like compulsory purchase to essentially buy the homes, or take the home. If they're rented, they'll just take the homes back from tenants and demolish them. Or there'll be a mix where some people that can afford to stay will stay. So the power there in terms of the balance is changing dramatically. And so we have to say that global capital and property developers that are using that capital have an increasing power to decide on the forms of regeneration in those spaces.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly my sense, as well. Even though the planning process is there and it has some checks and balances in it, if there's a state-led or local authority-led desire for a development to happen, it's very difficult to resist those, no matter the kind of fight you wish to put up.
I mean, I would also say that local authorities are having to do with huge cuts that, again, is mentioned in the lecture, over 40%. Their capacity to provide council housing is increasingly constrained. We now call it social housing. So one of the kind of key mechanisms that local authorities are using, across the country, is to give the planning permissions to property developers, but build into that a percentage that will be put aside for affordable and social housing, largely affordable housing. So you can understand why local authorities seek to do that for economic growth, to reduce welfare payments, to try and kind of change the demographic so there's more of a kind of income stream coming from those residents, and also the new economies that those spaces generate. Unfortunately, we know that. Sorry, I'll do one last thing. I'll just say that affordable housing is increasingly unaffordable. It's something like 80% of the market value of these properties, which most local people across the country are unable to participate in. They just can't afford these inflated prices.
So, I mean, there's obviously a requirement, or at least there's typically a requirement for a developer to include affordable housing in their development, however affordable housing is defined. But, I mean, one of the things that we know is that several things can often happen, in that mix. I mean, I think there was a famous story about the borough of Kensington and Chelsea, where lots of development was happening, and the council was effectively charging developers for the provision. They weren't asking the developers to build that social housing, but they were effectively charging the developer, and they were taking that money and promising to build that social housing, which was ultimately never built. So right. That's one thing that I know has happened. But secondly, even when that social housing or that affordable housing is built, there's often internal community exclusions and kind of power dynamics even within the developments. And you talk about pour doors. Can you perhaps, for those people who don't know about those, can you perhaps give us a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is an increasingly public phenomenon, if you like. The press are picking up on it, but what local authorities do they'll build in affordable housing and social housing, and what the developers will do is essentially build in segregation into these new apartment blocks. So effectively, they'll have the kind of front door with the concierge that the people that own properties in these new developments can access. For the people that are renting, for the people in the affordable housing, the social housing, they'll have a separate entrance. So they're effectively segregation is built in. So they'll go in, they'll have their own lifts, for example, to take them to their floor of the building. Developers argue that this is due to the need for charges on the maintenance of these properties, which they argue the people in the affordable housing simply can't afford. So they've essentially, it's benefiting those residents. I mean, we can make our own opinions up on that, but I don't think it's too controversial to say that there is social exclusion built into these new developments. There's also things like communal spaces. Segregation is being built into these communal spaces for people moving into these blocks. So there's been a big story around the Baylis Old School complex in Kennington and South London, where essentially there's been nice green spaces in the kind of central area for property owners to play in and to relax in. And the people renting have got their own separate playground on the edge of this development that they can actually see, this green space that they can't access. That may have changed now. It's ongoing, but it's worth following that up, I think. So it's the Baylis Old School complex in Kennington, if you're interested in following that up. So yeah, exclusion, segregation is being built in and is an increasing issue.
I mean, that's kind of an extraordinary thing, isn't it, when you think about it? I think we increasingly are knowledgeable about gated communities in the UK, even if they're not really a terribly UK phenomenon. Although there are many in this country, but I think we usually associate them with either developing world cities or the United States. But in that particular case, you've got almost internal gates within a community.
Yes.
On class or socioeconomic lines, even within the same development, which seems utterly extraordinary.
But is absolutely the case. Yes, it is. Yeah, I mean, like you say, these large kind of gated communities, places, we know about them from South Africa, from the United States, Los Angeles, etc. But this, as you say, this is a very different form of gating. Of segregation, effectively, that's what it is.
Yeah, and boundary making between class and socioeconomic.
Absolutely, it is all based on class. an income. And I know Robert Jenrick at the moment, who's in charge of housing. He's been looking at it, but nothing much has happened, and we shall see. Things change, so let's see. I'm hopeful things will change, but that certainly doesn't seem to be the case. I know James Brokenshire, who was Minister for Housing, pledged to remove the pool doors and the segregated play areas, but that doesn't seem to have happened yet.
Very interesting. Well, we will watch this space. And actually, there's a couple of questions that have come in, I'm delighted to say, which are related to the issue of change. So Lynn Katrina, for example, asks, and she's asking you to undertake a little bit of futurology here, Mike, if you would.
Oh, heck, okay.
So
I'll just get my crystal ball out. I have it.
How will the capital investment, presumably of large international finance companies, be impacted with changing work patterns post-COVID? Will regeneration still be developer-led in inner cities if people are moving out of cities to the rural-urban fringe? Which is actually a really interesting question, given the kind of speculation that there is at the moment about potential changing urban patterns post-COVID.
Yeah. Oh, goodness me. I mean, that's such a good question. I mean, what we might see is, that process of gentrification moving out of city centres. What we've seen is a real process of, some people call it revanchism, essentially the kind of middle classes, to put it crudely, grabbing the inner cities and pushing up property values there. So what we might see is, I wouldn't call it a suburbanisation. I think that idea of the rural and urban becoming increasingly kind of, what's the word really? Joining together in many ways. It's going to be increasingly harder to differentiate, I think, between the rural and the urban in that sense. I think it's worth remembering that a lot of this super gentrification is about parking money. It's not necessarily about people living in these units and these properties. So it'd be interesting to see how global capital reflects on these sorts of changes when the primary reason for buying a lot of these properties, these super gentrified spaces, like the Acon building that we looked at, isn't really about living in them. It's about parking your money. It's what's been called a kind of secondary circuit of accumulation that people like geographers like David Harvey talk about, where it's a new way of investing money, making money grow, soaking up surplus capital, essentially.
Yeah.
But I don't have the answer to that. But certainly properties prices will rise in these rural areas, and we're already seeing that.
We absolutely are. I happen to live. Mike is in central London at the moment. I'm out here in Egham, where Royal Holloway is, and already around here property prices are rising because the demand for living in a kind of semi-suburban, semi-rural area is increasing. And if that happens, the same process that we've already seen happening for the past 50 years in central London would surely follow, that property prices rise, shops respond, or maybe they don't anymore. Maybe that's one of the big changes here, because there's so much online purchasing that's now done. Yeah,
certainly. Again, I'm originally from rural Shropshire, and some of the villages where I live, people are moving out of London. They're not even commuting, and they're working from rural Shropshire in the London economy, effectively. Absolutely, I think it's worth reflecting on how high streets clearly are in a phase of transition, and in terms of gentrification, if that happens, what we're seeing is particularly kind of service sectors doing very well. Things like the coffee shop and the craft bar, it has to be said, rather than retail spaces. So that's kind of playing out in a different way. But yeah, absolutely. We'll see more of a kind of Ruth Glass form of gentrification, I think, in rural areas, potentially.
That's really interesting. And I think, this is just, of course, why geography is still such a vital and an important subject, that we can see these moments of change then often lead to a recurring of geographical processes that have already been well observed from different places, transported. But Mike, we have another question. Okay. This is from Joanne Osborne. And Joanne is asking, is community-led housing the answer to the problems of providing adequate social housing? So I don't know if community-led housing is a term that you would recognise, but clearly this is an opportunity to put the community right at the heart of decisions about housing provision.
I think the answer is no. unfortunately, but some really interesting community-led housing projects going on. The community housing trusts, they're growing, where communities will form kind of community banking, really community financing to, with help from landowners to create their own housing and maintain those housing, sell them at levels that reflect average wages at the local level. And when people sell them on, they need to sell them on at the average wage, essentially. So no one's profiting out of those housing. They are profiting, actually, in the sense that they're gaining a home. So, there's another way of thinking about value that's really important here. So community housing, yes, it's going to grow. It is growing. But we need to be housing. I mean, the numbers that we need to build is debatable, but certainly it's been identified at least 250,000 new homes a year. And community just can't fill that void. But hopefully we will see communities being more and more involved in at least the regeneration of their own communities. I know that Sadiq Khan, as the Mayor of London, has brought in a regulation in London now where housing can't be demolished in what was formerly council housing without the actual residents voting as a majority to demolish. So that's something, again, in terms of community-led, in terms of what form regeneration can take. I hope that answers the question.
I think it's
not a happy answer.
No, but it's a nuanced answer, and I think what you're saying is that community-led housing, it can play a part, but it can't be the complete answer. It's part of a mixed economy of housing provision that we need to have in order to achieve the 250,000 plus new homes per year.
I don't think it's purely in terms of the capital that's needed to fund this major housing programme, to address the housing crisis.
Yeah. Mike, can I just turn back? So we've kind of covered off, I think, the kind of organic... and Joanna's just saying thank you for that answer. I think that... And
I hope it helps, Joanna. It's not a happy answer, but I hope it helps. Sorry, Al, go on.
No, I'm sure Joanna, and Joanne, feel free to ask anything else, or just let us know if you want me to push Mike in a particular direction on that. But I think we've kind of covered off some of that organic gentrification, the Ruth Glass style gentrification. But I think I'd just like to try and push a little bit further on the more state-led kind of gentrification that we're seeing in developments such as Nine Elms, for example. Can you just tell us, so what role would you argue the state plays in that? So why would we call that a state-led gentrification process as opposed to other kind of gentrification?
Okay. Again, this is a rather London-specific answer, but hopefully there are similar patterns and processes, well, there are elsewhere. In the case of Nine Elms, it's worth going back to the year 2000. Ken Livingstone was elected the mayor of the new Greater London Assembly that replaced a void, and the void had replaced the Greater London Council. So we had Ken Livingstone in as the mayor, and he identified a number of areas across London that were essentially mainly brownfield sites, but run-down sites, very low land values, that he thought were strategically areas that could be regenerated in order to, essentially promote economic growth across London, but also address issues around poverty and deprivation. So Nine Elms is one of these opportunity areas. It essentially a brownfield site. They were, various industries there, various local industries, like lots of small industries, like, car repair shops, things like that. And the state essentially took control of the development of that area. So they invited bids to take over pockets of Nine Elms and regenerate those spaces. So what we've seen is this kind of gold rush going into Nine Elms in South London of capital through property developers grabbing bits and building these huge luxury apartments. Not all, it has to be said. Berkeley Homes have got the Riverlight Studios. One of those blocks is dedicated to more affordable housing, it has to be said. But essentially the state there is taking an active role in encouraging global capital into that space to regenerate it in order to essentially try and shift the economy of that space in Lambeth and Wandsworth into the central London economy, and therefore the global economy as a global city. So that is where the state is leading regeneration there. But then it gets complicated, I think, because then we're looking at this kind of super gentrification where the property developers are actually kind of increasing their purchase on the particular forms of regeneration in those spaces.
Mike, that's really interesting. So I think we so often associate gentrification purely with capitalist forces, whether that be individuals buying up property or multinational corporations or equity firms or whatever pumping money in. But in this particular case, it was the Greater London Assembly and its successor institutions that kind of rationalised the space that bought up and aggregated all of those different land titles into a unit that could be developed. Is that right?
Well, they didn't actually buy the spaces up. What they did was open them up to property developers and speculators to buy. So they would relax the planning regulations on those spaces. And clearly the people that own those sites saw these potential investors coming in and thought, oh, great, we'll have some of that. Come and buy our land and we'll make some very big profits. Like Royal Mail, for example, have been selling off pockets of their land that they own in the Nine Elms site for huge profits. And, then the property developers come in. Quite often, once the properties have been built, they'll then sell them on to, again, pension funds, etc., to global money.
That's really interesting. Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm really glad that you've clarified that. And actually, Joanne has very helpfully come back in and said that there's a really interesting article in The Guardian about this development. And
that's today, wasn't it, I think, or yesterday?
I get the feeling it might have been today's or yesterday's, because apparently it's also about... it talks about Penthouse and Pourdoors and how Europe's biggest regeneration project has fallen flat. I think that might be the subtitle of the article. So in fact, it's bringing together several strands of your lecture all together, which is absolutely superb.
We're always ahead of the curve at Royal Holloway. But it's a really interesting article, actually, and it does sum up a lot of these themes.
Mike, I know that the time is marching on, but I'm really interested in something that you mentioned earlier, and that's about Shoreditch, because we've talked a lot about housing at the moment in terms of gentrification and the kind of urban change. But of course, it's not just about the provision of housing, it's about new kind of industries as well. And you talked about gentrification and studentification, but I've also heard about hipsterification, and in relation to places like Shoreditch.
Yeah.
What do people mean by the hipsterization of particular communities?
Do you know what? I've absolutely, in one way, I've absolutely no idea up to a point. But what I would say is it goes back to essentially young people coalescing in particular parts of the city because they can afford to live there. And that's really important. So, we had the first wave, if you like, would move into places like Shoreditch. And the hipsters, it was a particular style at the time, potentially a particular worldview, I doubt that. But, the cliche of particular fashions, sleeve tattoos, and an interest in the creative economy. It's important to note, I think, that the creative clusters that developed around Shoreditch and, the hipsters, and let's be honest here, a lot of that kind of movement of creatives that were moving and hipsters that were moving into that part of East London were essentially white middle class, potentially professionals that were moving in, not necessarily on high incomes, but with the skills to create this kind of creative cluster. So there was, a particular kind of demography emerging there that have been called, the hipsters and this kind of creative economy and hipsterization of Shoreditch. And, it's understandable that once people move in, others will move in because we'll start to get those synergies of clusters. But also, the culture, it's a good vibe for people to go and move in. And really, that I think that explains a lot of what's happened in that part of East London.
And it's about housing, of course, but it's also about businesses. So as you say, that creative economy drive, and suddenly you've got lots of different businesses that are propelling one another, and you can suddenly develop this cluster, as you say, of creative, high-tech, AI industries in a particular place. I have to confess, I'm not an urban geographer, but I have read my Richard Florida. And Richard Florida is one of these geographers who has, frankly, made an absolute fortune selling a particular vision of cities around the world.
Yes, he has, and I mean, that absolutely applies. What Richard Florida does was identify the right conditions for the creative economy to flourish. So, hipsters, if you like, bohemians, diversity in all sorts of ways. So ethnic diversity, the LGBTQ community is seen as, a proxy for potentially creative spaces. And I have to say, some of Richard Florida's ideas are rather contentious, shall we say, and have been sometimes ridiculed, certainly criticised, but also have been seen as a really important vehicle for local authorities that strap for cash. They'll see this recipe, literally, of how to create these creative clusters and essentially, potentially gentrified areas, because again, they're strapped for cash. So if they can bring in these clusters without significant outlay, it makes sense to them to try and create these creative clusters and the associated gentrification that goes with them.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. He has kind of sold a recipe, from what I understand, to cities around the world, and he's paid a rich consultancy fee wherever he goes.
Absolutely. And there's no evidence I'm aware of. If any of viewers have got evidence of it, send it in, and we'll look at where his recipe has been triumphant. I'm not convinced that it's a recipe for success everywhere. It may be in some spaces, but there we are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where it's been triumphant, but I know that he has applied this to, Sydney and Melbourne, and I was in Glasgow a few years ago, and the city leaders there were talking about Richard Florida and his ideas. And you're right, they were also talking about, they were calling it the pink pound, but they were effectively talking about the LGBTQ plus community as being a kind of proxy for creativity.
Absolutely.
That if they could create the conditions in which that community felt comfortable to settle, then this could lead to urban change.
Absolutely. And I think it's been, again, they've been transforming waterfront spaces in every city, almost across the planet, really, certainly across the UK. And there's been state-led intervention here to regenerate those spaces, to gentrify those spaces, particularly using the creative industries. I think it's worth adding that for the creatives, the hipsters, if you like, that moved into Shoreditch, significant numbers are having to move elsewhere, places like Margate, places like Croydon, because, if you like, big industry has followed them in, and you can understand that. But again, it's that knock-on effect of property prices going up, rent values going up, and for the small and medium enterprises, that could be almost too much. So they've found themselves having to relocate. So this is kind of, push and pull effect going on across our cities.
Mike, thank you. That has been a really fascinating conversation, and thank you also to Joanne and to Lynn for their excellent questions. I really appreciate their engagement. Mike, thank you. Now, this is the second of the live Q&As for this particular season, and we have more coming up, but I want to just share with you a little bit of extra information. First of all, to say that Mike's lecture is accompanied on our Raw Holloway Teacher Hub with a really excellent teaching resource that can be downloaded that Mike has put together, and I'm currently showing you on your screens the posters and information about the Teacher Hub. So log on to that address there, rawholloway.ac.uk/geography/teacher-hub, and you can access the lectures and the live Q&As on the pages, and also you can download the teaching resources associated with each lecture. And my lecture from last term on superpowered geopolitics will be accompanied with a teaching resource within the next few days. I think I'm the laggard and haven't quite done it yet. And then sorry, Mike, come in.
Well, I would welcome feedback from teachers. I hope they work well. The exercise on Cressingham Gardens. Feedback will be welcome, because obviously we're not quite second guessing how it will work in a classroom environment. But feedback is always welcome to kind of make it more focused if needs be for the needs of AS level students. I would also say that it's ongoing, Cressingham Gardens, so it's live and very much a real story. So we need to be careful how we think about the residents living in Cressingham Gardens and the dilemmas that they face, but also have a look at the extraordinary potential that some of their ideas, their innovativeness, I think, maybe goes back to the earlier question from Joanna about the potential of community-led forms of regeneration.
Actually, Joanna just added an extra comment in that it just says, thanks so much. That was super interesting. That's
Thank you very much.
Down to you, Mike. And I'm loving these resources. They're really helpful for the slightly killer topic of regenerating places at A-level.
Right.
And I know, we've spoken to quite a lot of teachers over the past few months, and I know that some of the topics at A-level are, like identity and place and sense of place and that kind of thing, and regenerating places can be a little bit difficult in order to make sense of to A-level students. So I'm glad that these are proving helpful, and I think in the spirit of collaboration, I just echo what Mike has said. We are really happy to work together with teachers in order to produce resources
Absolutely.
that are genuinely helpful to you and to the broader teaching community. And I think that's the spirit in which we are engaging with this.
Very much so.
So just to say then, in the weeks ahead, we've got a couple more sessions coming up before Easter, and I've got the dates for you here. First of all, we've got, starting on the 22nd of February, we have Daniele Colombaroli, who is going to be talking about the carbon cycle, and in particular focusing on wildfires. And then the week after that, so the 9th of February, we've got the live Q&A that he and I will be doing together. And then we have, on the 8th of March, we have Professor Catherine Brickell talking about modern slavery and reflecting on her work on an amazing project called the Blood Bricks Project, which was an incredible project and actually won the Times Higher Education Project of the Year just a few months ago. It's absolutely super, and I think you'll all get a lot out of that as well. And similarly, the week after, I'll be doing a live Q&A with Catherine on the Facebook page as well. So that's the plans for the next few weeks. Mike, thank you again for your time this evening. It was really fantastic. And everyone at home, thanks so much for watching. Lynn and Joanne and all of the others who have been watching this evening, thanks very much for your input. All the best.
Take care.
We'll see you again very soon.